Hi everybody, it's Sydney again, just back with another story time. I hope you guys enjoyed meeting Nira last week. She's one of my best friends and it meant a lot to me that she took the time out of her busy, training schedule to read a story for you guys. Today I don't really have one planned. I figure every time I'm just gonna open the pages and see like which one speaks to me and which one seems like it would be really cool and have cool morals and teach everyone about the mortal realm versus the Fae realm. But yeah, okay, I think I'm gonna get into it. Quick today. Alright. Well, I mean, I might as well just read this one. I was already kind of open to it anyway. Serendipitous. I actually think I've heard of this one before. It might be familiar to some of you. It's called Thumbelina. I think they've made some movies about it too, but like I said before, these are definitely very different from any modern adaptations, so keep that in mind. But this is Thumbelina. Once upon a time, there was a woman who dearly wanted to have a tiny little child, but she had no idea where to get one. So she went to an old witch and said to her, "There's so many witches in these stories. I want so much to have a little child. Won't you tell me where I might get one?" "Oh yes, I could think we can manage that," said the witch. "Here's a grain of barley, but it's not the kind that grows in the farmer's field or the kind that chickens have to eat. Put it in a flower pot and then you'll have something to see." "Thank you so much," said the woman, and gave the witch 12 skillings. She went home, planted the grain of barley, and a lovely big flower sprang up at once. It looked exactly like a tulip, but its petals were closed tight as if it were still a bud. See, this is an example of a very good and helpful witch. They're not all bad. "What a charming flower," said the woman, and kissed the beautiful red and yellow petals. But just as she kissed them, the flower gave a loud bang and opened. It was a real tulip. She could see that now. But in the middle of the flower on that green stool sat a tiny little girl, so delicate and charming. She was no taller than a thumb, and that's why she was named Thumbelina. She was given a charming lacquered walnut shell for a cradle, blue-violet petals for her mattress, and a rose petal for her comforter. That's where she slept at night. But in the daytime, she played on the table where the woman had set a dish. Around it, she placed an entire wreath of flowers with their stems sticking into the water, where a big tulip petal floated. This was where Thumbelina sat, sailing from one side of the dish to the other. She had 2 white hairs to use as oars. It looked perfectly lovely. She could also sing. Her voice was elegant and charming, like nothing anyone had ever heard. One night, she lay in her beautiful bed, and a hideous toad hopped through the window. One of the panes was broken. The toad was vile, big, and wet, and she jumped right down onto the table where Thumbelina lay sleeping under the rose petal. "What a lovely wife for my son!" said the toad, and she seized hold of the walnut shell where Thumbelina was sleeping, and hopped out of the window with her down to the garden. There a big wide stream ran. But near the bank it was marshy and muddy, and that was where the toad lived with her son. Ugh, he was so vile and horrid, and he looked exactly like his mother. "Go-ax, brick-ax," was all he could say when he saw the charming little girl in the walnut shell. Not very articulate. "Don't talk so loud or you'll wake her up," said the old toad. "She might still run away from us because she's as light as a swan down. We'll put her in the stream on one of those big water lily pads. Since she's so little and light, it will seem just like an island to her. She won't be able to escape while we fix up a good parlor down with the mud where you two will live together." This is a straight-up kidnapping. So many water lilies grew in the stream with big green pads that looked as if they were floating on the water. The pad that was farthest away was also the biggest. The old toad swam out to it, and there she left the walnut shell with Thumbelina in it. The poor tiny girl woke up quite early the next morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry bitterly because there was water on all sides of the big green lily pad, and it was impossible for her to reach land. The old toad was sitting in the mud, decorating her parlor with reeds and yellow water lilies. Everything was going to be so fine for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam with her vile son out to the lily pad where Thumbelina stood. They wanted to get her pretty bed and set it up in the bridal chamber before she arrived. The old toad made a deep curtsy before her in the water and said, "Here you see my son! He's going to be your husband, and the two of you will live so splendidly down in the mud." "Go axe, go break axe," was all the son could say. Then they took the charming little bed and swam off with it. Thumbelina sat alone on the green lily pad weeping, because she didn't want to live with the horrid toad, or have the hideous son for her husband. The little fish swimming in the water must have seen the toad and heard what she said, because they poked their heads up and wanted to see the little girl. As soon as they caught sight of her, they found her quite charming, and they felt terrible that she would have to go live with the vile toad. No, that was never going to happen. Down in the water they gathered around the green stem that held the lily pad she was standing on. With their teeth they chewed through the stem, and then the lily pad floated downstream, carrying off Thumbelina, far away where the toad would never go. Thumbelina sailed past scores of towns, and the little birds sitting in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a charming little maiden!" The lily pad carrying her drifted farther and farther away. That was how Thumbelina ended up traveling abroad. A charming little white butterfly kept flying around her and finally landed on the lily pad because he was quite fond of Thumbelina. She was so happy because now the toad couldn't reach her, and everywhere she sailed was so lovely. The sun shone in the water. It was like the loveliest of gold. She took off her sash and tied one end to the butterfly. The other end of the ribbon she fastened to the lily pad. Then it moved much faster, and she did too because she was standing on the pad after all. At that moment, a big cockchafer beetle came flying past. He caught sight of her and in a flash fastened his claw around her slender waist and flew up into the tree with her. But the green lily pad kept floating downstream, and the butterfly flew along with it because he was tied to the lily pad and could not pull free. Lord, how frightened Thumbelina was when she saw the beetle flew up in the tree with her. But she was even sadder about the beautiful white butterfly that she had tied to the lily pad. If he couldn't get free, he would starve to death. But the beetle didn't care about that. He set her on the biggest leaf of the tree, gave her blossom nectar to eat, and said she was very charming, though she didn't look like a cockchafer beetle. That's a backhanded compliment if I've ever heard one. Then all the other beetles that lived in the tree came to visit. They looked at Thumbelina, and then the lady beetles tugged at their antennae, and one of them said, "But she only has 2 legs. How pitiful she looks." "She has no antennae," said the other. "She's so thin around the waist. Ugh, she looks like a human being. How horrid she is," said all the female beetles. And yet Thumbelina was so charming. How kind of them. Despite her fatal flaws, i.e., looking like a human, she was still so nice. Rude. That's what the beetle who had brought her thought, but all the others said she was hideous. In the end, he thought so too, and he didn't want to keep her anymore. She could go wherever she liked. They flew down from the tree with her and set her on a daisy. There she sat and wept because she was so ugly that the cockchafer beetles didn't want to keep her, and yet she was the loveliest creature imaginable, as delicate and as radiant as the most beautiful rose petal. Okay, I'm going to take a moment to say, I think, of course this isn't the main plot of the story, but this is a prime example of someone who has a lot of wonderful things going for them, and the voices of others bringing her down. She's described as beautiful and lovely, yet when she is ridiculed by other creatures, she feels sad because she doesn't realize how wonderful she is. You don't need to go through life not realizing how wonderful you are. You are beautiful. Don't listen to beetles. Beetles never know what they're talking about. You're better than a beetle. All summer long, poor Thumbelina lived all alone in the big forest. She wove a bed for herself out of blades of grass and hung it under a big dock leaf to keep it off the rain. She plucked nectar from flowers to eat and drank from the dew that settled on the leaves each morning. In this way, the summer and autumn passed. But then came winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung so beautifully for her flew off, and the trees and flowers withered. The big dock leaf she had been living under curled up, becoming nothing more than a withered yellow stalk. She was dreadfully cold because her clothes were tattered, and she was so tiny and delicate. Poor Thumbelina. She was about to freeze to death. Snow began to fall, and every snowflake that fell on her was like having an entire shovelful thrown on us, because they were big and she was only as tall as a thumb. Then she wrapped herself in a withered leaf, but it gave no warmth, and she shivered with the cold. At the edge of the forest where she ended up stood a big field of grain, but the grain had long since disappeared, and only the bare, dry stubble was left standing on the frozen ground. For her it seemed like an entire forest to walk through, and oh, how she shivered from the cold. Then she came to the field mouse's door. It was a little hole under the grain stubble. That's where the field mouse lived, warm and snug, with a whole room full of grain and a lovely kitchen and a pantry. Poor Thumbelina stood outside the door, like any other poor beggar girl, and asked for a little bit of barley. She hadn't had a scrap to eat in 2 days. "You poor little thing," said the field mouse, because she was actually a kind old field mouse. "Come inside my warm house and eat with me." Since she had taken a liking to Thumbelina, she said, "You're welcome to stay with me this winter, but you have to keep my house nice and clean and tell me stories, because I'm quite fond of stories." And Thumbelina did, and the kind old field mouse asked and settled in quite comfortably. "We'll be having a visitor soon," said the field mouse. "My neighbor usually comes to visit me once a week. He's even more well off than I am. He has big rooms and wears such a lovely black velvet coat. If only you could win him as your husband, you would be well provided for. But he can't see. You have to tell him the most charming stories you know." But Thumbelina didn't much like that idea. She had no desire to have the neighbor as her husband because he was a mole. He came to visit in his black velvet coat. He was very rich and cultivated, said the field mouse. His lodgings were also more than 20 times bigger than hers, and he had book learning. But he didn't like the sun or the beautiful flowers. He had nothing good to say about them because he had never seen them. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang both "Beetle, Beetle, Fly Away" and "The Monk Walks Through the Meadow." And the mole fell in love with her because of her beautiful voice, though he said nothing because he was a sober-minded man. He had recently dug a long passageway through the earth from this house to theirs, and the field mouse and Thumbelina were invited to promenade along it whenever they liked. He told them not to be frightened by the dead bird lying in the passageway. It was a whole bird with feathers and beak, and it must have died not long when winter came. Now it lay buried in the very spot where he had made his passage. The mole took a stick of torchwood in his mouth because it shines like fire in the dark. He went first, lighting the way for them in the long dark passage. When they reached the place where the dead bird lay, the mole shoved his wide nose against the ceiling and pushed up the earth, making a big hole so the light could shine through. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, with his beautiful wings pressed rightly to his sides, his legs and head tucked under his feathers. The poor bird had undoubtedly died from the cold. Thumbelina felt very sorry for him. She was so fond of all the little birds. All summer long they had sung and chirped so beautifully for her. But the mole kicked the bird with his stubby legs and said, "He's not going to do any more peeping. What a pitiful thing to be born a little bird. Thank the Lord that won't happen to any of my own children. A bird like this is nothing but his chirping and then ends up starving to death in the winter time." "Yes, you're right about that. Sensible man you are," said the field mouse. "What does a bird have for all his chirping when winter comes? He ends up starving and freezing, and that's supposed to be so noble." Thumbelina didn't say a word. Yet when the other two had turned their backs on the bird, she bent down, pushed the feathers aside that lay over his head, and kissed his closed eyes. "Maybe this is the one who sang so beautifully to me this summer," she thought. "What a great joy you brought me, dear friend. You dear, beautiful bird." Then the mole closed up the hole through which the daylight was shining and escorted the ladies home. That night Thumbelina couldn't sleep a wink, so she got out of bed and wove a big, beautiful blanket out of hay, then carried it down and tucked it around the dead bird. She placed some soft cotton she had found in the field mouse's house alongside the bird, so that he would be warm on the cold earth. "Farewell, you beautiful little bird," she said. Farewell, and thank you for your lovely song this summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shone so warm on all of us." Then she laid her head on the bird's breast. But at that instant she grew quite frightened, for it sounded as if something were beating inside. It was the bird's heart. The bird wasn't dead. He was in deep slumber, and now he was warm, he was revived. In the autumn the swallows all fly off to the warm countries, but if one of them lingers he freezes and then falls to the ground quite dead. He lies where he falls, and the cold snow covers him up. Thumbelina was so frightened she was shaking all over, because the bird was very, very big compared to her, and she was only as tall as a thumb. But she gathered her courage, pulled the cotton closer around the poor swallow, and went to get a mint leaf that she had been using as a coverlet. She placed it over the bird's head. The following night she went back down to see the bird. By then he was very much alive, but so weak that he could open his eyes for only a brief moment to look at Thumbelina, who stood with a piece of torchwood in her hand because she had no other lantern. "Thank you, my charming little child," said the sick swallow. "I feel so wondrously warm. Soon I'll have my strength back and I can fly again out into the warm sunshine." "Oh," she said, "it's so cold outside, it's snowing and frosty. Stay here in your warm bed and I'll take care of you." She brought the swallow some water in a flower petal, and the bird drank and told her how he'd torn a wing on a hawthorn bush. That's why he couldn't fly as well as the other swallows when they flew far, far away to the warm countries. Finally, he had fallen to the ground, but he couldn't remember anything more and had no idea how he had ended up here. All winter long he stayed down here, and Thumbelina was kind to him and grew quite fond of him. Neither the mole nor the field mouse had even an inkling about this, because after all, they cared nothing for the poor, pitiful swallow. As soon as spring arrived and the sun warmed the earth, the swallow said farewell to Thumbelina, who opened up the hole that the mole had made overhead. The sun flooded in so wondrously, and the swallow asked if she wanted to come with him. She could sit on his back and they would fly far away into the green forest. But Thumbelina knew it would make the field mouse sad if she left like that. "No, I can't," said Thumbelina. "Farewell, farewell, you kind, charming girl," said the swallow, and flew out into the sunlight. Thumbelina gazed after him, and tears rose in her eyes because she was very fond of the poor swallow. "Feet, feet, feet," sang the bird, and flew into the green forest. Thumbelina was very sad. She wasn't allowed to go into the warm sunshine. The grain that had been sown on the ground above the field mouse's house grew so high into the air that it too seemed like a great dense forest, and the poor little girl, who was only as tall as a thumb. "This summer you need to start sewing your trousseau," said the field mouse told her, because her neighbor, the dreary old mole in the black velvet coat, had now proposed to Thumbelina. "You'll need both woolen and linens. You'll need cushions and bedding when you become the mole's wife." Thumbelina had to use a spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave day and night. Every evening the mole would come to visit, and he always talked about when the summer would end and the sun was no longer so hot. Right now it was scorching the earth as hard as stone. Yes, when the summer was over he would celebrate his wedding with Thumbelina, but she was not pleased at all, because she wasn't the least bit fond of the dreary mole. Every morning when the sun came up and every evening when it went down, she would slip out to the doorway, and when the wind parted the tops of the grain she could see the blue sky, and she thought how bright and beautiful it was outside, and wished she might once again see the dear swallow. But he never came back. No doubt he was flying far away in the beautiful green forest. By the time autumn came, Thumbelina's trousseau was finished. "In 4 weeks you'll celebrate your wedding," the field mouse told her. But Thumbelina wept and said she didn't want to marry the dreary mole. "Pish posh," said the field mouse. "Don't be obstinate or I'll have to bite you with my white tooth. You're getting a lovely husband. Even the queen doesn't have the likes of his black velvet coat. Both his kitchen and his cellar are full. You should thank the Lord for him." If you're not in love, you're not in love. It doesn't matter. Then it was time for the wedding. The mole had already come to get Thumbelina. She was going to live with him, deep underground, and never come out to the warm sunlight, because he didn't like the sun. The poor child was so sad now because she had bid farewell to the sun. At least she had been allowed to look at it from the field mouse's doorway. "Farewell, bright sun," she said, stretching her arms into the air as she took a few steps outside the field mouse's house. By now the grain had been harvested, and all that remained was the dry stubble. "Farewell, farewell," she said, and threw her tiny arms around a little red flower standing there. "Say hello to the little swallow for me if you ever see him." "Feet, feet, feet!" she suddenly heard overhead. She looked up, and there was the little swallow just flying past. As soon as he saw Thumbelina, he was overjoyed. She told him how unwilling she was to have a hideous mole for her husband, and that she was going to live deep underground where the sun never shone, and she couldn't help crying. "The cold winter is coming," said Little Swallow, "and I'm going to fly far away to the warm countries. Do you want to come with me? You can sit on my back. Tie yourself down with your sash, and we'll fly from the hideous mole in his dark house, far away over the mountains to the warm countries, where the sun shines more beautifully than here, where it's always summer with lovely flowers. Fly with me, sweet little Thumbelina. You saved my life when I lay frozen in the dark earth cellar." "Yes, I'll go with you," said Thumbelina, and climbed onto the bird's back, put her feet on his outspread wings, and tied her belt onto the strongest feathers. Then the swallow flew up into the sky, over forests and over lakes, high up over the great mountains that are always covered with snow. And Thumbelina shivered in the cold air, but then she crept under the bird's warm feathers and stuck out her little head to see all the delights below. At last they came to the warm countries. There the sun shone much brighter than here. The sky was twice as high, and along ditches and fences grew the loveliest green and blue grapes. Lemons and oranges hung in the forests that were fragrant with the myrtle and mint. The most charming children ran along the road and played with big, colorful butterflies. But the swallow flew even farther, and everything was more and more beautiful. Under the loveliest of green trees near the blue lake stood a dazzling white marble palace from ancient times. Grapevines twined around the tall pillars, and on the very top perched scores of swallow nests. In one of them lived the swallow that was carrying Thumbelina. "There's my house," said the swallow, "but if you want to choose one of the magnificent flowers down below, I'll take you down there and you'll be as comfortable as you can imagine." "Oh, wonderful," she said, clapping her tiny hands. There was a huge white marble column that had fallen to the ground and broken into 3 pieces, but among them grew the most beautiful white flowers. The swallow flew down there with Thumbelina and set her on one of the wild petals. How surprised she was! There sat a little man in the middle of the flower, as white and transparent as if he were made of glass. He had the most charming golden crown on his head and the loveliest bright wings on his shoulders. He was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the flower's angel. In every flower lived a little man or woman just like him, but he was king of them all. "Good Lord, how handsome he is," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The little prince was terribly frightened by the swallow because the bird was gigantic compared to him. He was quite tiny and delicate. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was so happy. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. That's why he took the golden crown from his head and put it on hers, asking her what her name was and whether she would be his wife. Then she would be queen of all the flowers. Yes, he was certainly quite a man, not like the toad's son or the mole with the black velvet coat. That's why she said yes to the lovely prince. And from every flower came a lady or gentleman, all so charming that they were a joy to see. Each of them brought a gift for Thumbelina, but the best of all was a pair of beautiful wings from a big white fly. They were fastened to Thumbelina's back, so then she too could fly from flower to flower. Everyone rejoiced, and the little swallow sat up in his nest and sang for them as best he could. But in his heart he was sad, because he was so fond of Thumbelina and never wanted to be parted from her. "Your name will no longer be Thumbelina," the flower's angel told her. "That's a horrid name. You're so beautiful. We'll call you Maja." "Farewell, farewell," said the little swallow, and flew off again, far from the warm countries, far away back to Denmark. There he had a little nest above a window where the man lives who tells fairy tales. He's the one for whom the swallow sang, "Veet, veet, veet," and that's where we heard the whole story. Oh, well, that one ended so nicely and so well. So I suppose it wasn't necessarily a story about the Fey realm versus the mortal realm. It sounds like this happened very much in the mortal realm. Then again, I don't know much about toad and beetle culture, so maybe that's on me. But that was a lovely little story, and I'm very grateful for the old man who listened to the swallow, because otherwise then we wouldn't have this beautiful book, this beautiful story. I hope you have a lovely day, and I hope you are staying home and staying safe in these troubling times. And I hope that when you listen to these stories, they make you happy, because they make me happy when I read them to you. Bye everybody. Have a good day.